chairman of the Manhattan Institute. So hopefully we'll get some lots of good tools for you guys to start looking into those folks. Okay, cool. It's 7:04, so I think we'll get started. Feel free to keep introducing yourself in the chat and take a look to see who else is on with us tonight. Thanks everyone for joining in this. I think it's our fourth Research Tools for Organizers training as part of our Research Tools for Organizers series this summer. My name is Molly Gott, and I work with Little Sis. I'm going to be helping lead tonight's training along with Allie Shaw, you all can see on the video. And yeah, tonight we're going to be focusing on researching billionaires. We're going to talk specifically about some tools that you can use to do that, the types of research questions you might want to know about billionaires, why we want to research billionaires, and as well as some tools that are kind of relevant for other powerful people who aren't billionaires as well. Just to get started, a couple of housekeeping things. So you can use the chat to talk with each other. If you have questions about anything that we're saying or want to make sure a message is getting to me or Allie, you can use the Q&A function. And Manira, wonderful Manira from Little Sis, is monitoring that, and she will do her best to make sure that we're answering people's questions in there. Just so people know, we'll make sure to send around the slides tonight as well as a recording of this training. So don't worry about, having to download or take notes or whatever. At the end of the presentation, I'll put up a QR code even that people can use to access the slides, and we'll also send a follow-up email. So don't worry too much about that. A couple of things so that people know kind of what's in store for tonight. I think we'll take about an hour and a half. We're going to talk a little bit about why we're focusing this webinar on billionaires and researching them. We're going to talk about a couple of campaign examples that Little Sis has been part of recently that has used research on billionaires so that people can get a sense of kind of the types of information that power researchers often want to look for when digging into billionaires, and kind of how that is used to weaken their power. And then we're really going to spend the most of tonight going through resources and tools that you can use to start digging into a particular billionaire, or even identifying what billionaire you might want to look into as part of your campaign. Like I was saying, there were a lot of good ones named in the chat. So we'll talk about littlesis.org, our research tool that compiles a lot of info on billionaires. We're going to talk about tracking campaign contributions from billionaires and other ultra wealthy people, identifying scandals or other kind of like violations, business violations and regulatory violations that billionaires are affiliated with, finding their assets, including mansions and jets and all that kind of stuff. And then also kind of mapping connections and kind of the web between billionaires. So yeah, that's a little bit about what we'll be doing tonight. We can go to the next slide. I think that a lot of people who are on tonight have been on previous ones of our trainings this summer, but for those of you who are new, welcome, and we're really glad you're with us and that you found out about this series. Like I said, this is hosted by Little Sis. We are called Little Sis because we are the opposite of Big Brother, Little Sister. We're a research organization that does watchdog research, specializing in mapping powerful people and organizations. As part of that work, we train organizations and activists on the ins and outs of doing that research to try to build additional strategic research capacity in social movements. And then we also oversee tech tools that help do that research, like littlesis.org, which we're going to talk a little bit more about tonight, which is our free open source platform. We sometimes call it an involuntary Facebook of the 1% that tracks connections between super powerful people and organizations and politicians. And then we also have a tool called Holographer, which is a data visualization tool that helps map out some of those connections, and we'll show some examples of that later. But so that's a little bit about us. Like I mentioned, and hopefully like people know, tonight's training is part of a broader series that we're doing on the kind of basics of strategic power research for activists and organizers. So we're about halfway through. I guess we're a little more than halfway through by the end of this evening. For our Billionaires and Other Powerful People training. The next one, we're taking a break in August. The next one will be in September on the 19th, where we're going to go really in depth into money and politics. We're going to give like a little preview of that tonight, but we'll go more in depth next time. So if you are interested in future trainings, make sure to go to the link that's here and sign up for them. You can go to mapthepower.net too and sign up there, and make sure to join us. You can go to the next slide. I think I mentioned these already, but if you have questions, put them in the Q&A and Manira will do her best to answer, or make sure that she gets those questions to me or Allie so we can answer. You know, the chat we have a lot of people on tonight, over 100, so the chat can get a little wild. So just make sure you're kind of keeping questions and topics in there pertinent to what we're talking about. But if there's stuff you're excited about or stuff you want to share, other research tools that you've used, information, etc., feel free to put it in there as well. We can go to the next one, I think, Allie. So yeah, this is, as promised, the QR code that you can use to get the slides for tonight. So we'll put it at the end as well. But if you want to scan that right now, you'll find the slides for our last several trainings. And then after tonight, the ones from tonight will be in there. And we have a YouTube channel, Public Accountability Initiative, so they're also all there. But like I said, we'll make sure if you were registered for tonight, you'll get an email as well. A couple things, just kind of reviewing from the last couple of trainings we did, and to kind of help orient everyone to the type of research we do at Little Sis and kind of why we're doing this and why we're here. We talked in our first webinar a lot about kind of the idea of strategies for social change, and kind of used this strategy from this book, Practical Radicals, 7 Strategies to Change the World, their definition of strategy as kind of a starting place for all of us to be working from. And their definition is a plan to achieve a goal under conditions of uncertainty with limited resources facing opposition. And so I know that, you know, everyone on here is part of organizations that are building their own strategies, that are carrying out their own strategies, that maybe have different strategies, that have shared points of interest. And really at Little Sis, we really kind of focus on this last part of this definition, this facing opposition, and think that a key part of having a strategy in a social movement context and being able to carry out that strategy is having a really deep understanding of our opposition, their interests, who they are, both organizations and specific people, what they care about, how they differ from us, etc. So yeah, we talked a lot in the first session about kind of concepts from that book, which we really recommend. I think there's a podcast, and I think Manira actually was on it, talking about Little Sis's work. So if people are interested in that and kind of a little bit more in the kind of like theory of power research and why we do it and examples, check out either our first webinar or check out Manira on the podcast. Okay, cool. Couple other just like definitional terms so that we're all kind of working from the same place. I've already said the word power like a million times. And just very simply, the way we think about it at Little Sis is the ability to make the world how you want it to be, even against opposition. And that becomes really relevant to this kind of research. You can go to the next slide, actually, Allie. Because there's lots of different types of power. There's our power, you know, working people's power, social movement power. Our opposition also has power. This is again from that same book. They talk about kind of different, I think it's 7, maybe it's 6 different kinds of power: solidarity power, disruptive power, economic power, ideological power, political power, and military power. And there's all different ways that we have that as social movements, these different kinds of power. Our opposition has it. And a lot of these are ones that we're contesting for as well. And yeah, like I said, go check out the first training we did to get more into these. But yeah, when we're talking about power here, we're often talking about our opposition's power, but we don't want to kind of minimize the power that we also have. We can go to the next slide. So the type of research we do focuses on the power of people, organizations, and institutions that are shaping the world as it currently is, who are benefiting from the status quo, and who are oftentimes standing in the way of us as we're trying to change it. We call the kind of constellation of those people, organizations, and institutions the power structure, and the people who dominate it, the power elite. And so that's going to be really relevant today when we're talking about these billionaires who are part of the power structure and the power elite, both at the local level, state level, national level, international level, and are showing up in campaigns and work that everyone on here is doing. We can go to the next slide. So yeah, this is just a little bit more about what power research is, research on the networks of those power elite and powerful people. And kind of our belief at Little Sis is that doing this kind of power research helps inform strategy, helps inform opportunities to put pressure on specific members of the power elite in ways that can help kind of undermine their power. And we can go to the next slide. There's a big history of this kind of research in social movements. This here is an example of from SNCC, of their kind of research department and the kind of information that their field organizers would have when they would go into a new town and start organizing. And again, Little Sis has done a lot of work to kind of uncover the history of this, and you can check out previous trainings and blog posts about that. But yeah, we just always like to say that we see ourselves as kind of part of a longer tradition of this kind of research in social movement contexts. And one thing that I think we've said like a bunch of times in these trainings is that, you know, like I was saying, the kind of research that we do is different from maybe other kinds of like journalistic research or transparency work, in that when you're doing this kind of research, we really encourage people to think about, we don't just want information for the sake of having information, although there are good things about that. We want to use the information to strategically weaken corporate power in particular. And so there's certain types of things, we'll talk more about them tonight, pieces of information that can be useful in that regard. And it's kind of helpful to kind of, as we're starting to show examples of tools, have that at the forefront of your mind, because oftentimes this kind of research, you could research forever and forever and forever if the goal is just to find more information. But if the goal is to strategically weaken corporate power, that helps kind of narrow the type of information we're looking for and prioritize finding. So we can go to the next slide. So cool. So I'm going to hand it to Allie, and she's going to talk a little bit more about kind of why we decided to frame this particular training around billionaires, and why a lot of Little Sisters work in recent years has focused on investigating billionaires. So I'll give it to you, Allie.
All right. Thanks, Molly. And like she said, I'm Allie Shaw. I'm a researcher at Little Sis based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I'm going to talk first about why we would want to research billionaires. We've talked about corporations and nonprofits, and it might be obvious to some people, but just in case you are wondering, wealthy people, and especially billionaires, have immense power and control over our political systems, from a federal level to a state level to even a local level, but also our economic systems. They have control over our social media platforms. They're our bosses at work. They're increasingly becoming our landlords as they buy up housing stock and homes around the country. And they have power over things like our universities and our cultural institutions, because they're oftentimes major donors and can influence what universities do, or what museums and different cultural institutions do, by wielding that money and power over them. And billionaires have gotten a lot wealthier just in the past few decades. And just in the past few years, they made, I think billionaires as a whole in the United States got about 60% wealthier just during the pandemic, while people were being laid off or even dying because of COVID-19. And they've been spending more and more money on elections to, again, have influence and control over our elections and our policy making at a state, federal, and local level. And if you've been paying attention to the news lately, the RNC convention is happening right now. I think Trump is actually supposed to speak tonight to accept the GOP nomination for president. But actually, billionaires have played a big role in the ticket, the Republican ticket, also on the Democratic side. But because J.D. Vance was just selected as the vice president and Donald Trump is speaking tonight, we thought we would mention a couple of billionaires that are playing a big role. And you can see them in the middle there, former co-founders of PayPal, Peter Thiel on the left and Elon Musk on the right. Peter Thiel was essentially the donor that led J.D. Vance to win his Senate seat in Ohio. He's a big libertarian, extremely conservative right-wing donor in California that was friends with J.D. Vance and propelled him into victory just a few years ago. And his PayPal co-founder, Elon Musk, I think everyone pretty much knows who he is, just recently pledged to spend $55 million per month on Trump's campaign on one of his super PACs, which would just in a few months make him the biggest donor in the country. So that we're talking about really an intense and impactful amount of money here that could have a huge influence over the election. But it's not just presidential elections. They have lots of influence over down ballot races, state level races, and even local races, which we'll talk about later. And not only have they expanded their wealth in general, but Citizens United, that Supreme Court decision, and later decisions have allowed billionaires to spend even more money in our politics and become more of a factor, especially on a federal level where races are getting increasingly very expensive. So you can see this chart. After Citizens United, the super wealthy and billionaires have been able to spend more and more money on our politicians. And, that allows them to have a real say in policy and kind of develop politicians as they would like to see them and get things passed that might just be pet projects for them or in the interest of billionaires, like cutting taxes for the wealthy. I'm going to talk about a billionaire in Pennsylvania that has made it his mission to privatize schools all over the country. They oftentimes want to get rid of regulations or union bust. So all of this political activity done by billionaires at all levels of our elections has a real impact and undermines our democracy and ultimately maintains the status quo of income inequality. So now we'll talk about a couple examples of how campaigns actually use this information. So before we get to the tools that we'll teach you, really be thinking about these campaign examples and thinking about how you can use this research to actually implement a campaign or create accountability around these billionaires and their outsized influence in our society. And I'm going to start by talking about a guy I just mentioned, Jeffrey Yass. If you haven't heard of him, he is one of the biggest donors on a national level this cycle. He's the richest man in Pennsylvania, and he is by far the biggest donor on a state level in Pennsylvania. He is the managing director and co-founder of financial firm Susquehanna International Group, and he was a major early investor in TikTok, which is where the bulk of his wealth comes from. And in Pennsylvania, we've had a campaign for a few years now to hold him accountable for his outside role in Pennsylvania's politics and our legislative process. So a couple examples, we used campaign finance research, which I'll talk about later, to look at what elected officials in our state he was giving the most money to and who were pushing his agenda, most recently to pass a school vouchers bill in Pennsylvania. So we had people from all over the state drive to Harrisburg, bring these giant checks that you see in the middle with the amount of money that elected official has accepted from Jeffrey Yass. Bring that giant check, bring these signs and people from all over the state to hold him accountable and ultimately name that this is an extremely toxic right-wing billionaire who has outsized influence over our legislative process, and our elected officials shouldn't be listening to him, but they should be listening to the people. So we're trying to drive that wedge between our politicians and this toxic billionaire, and partially doing that by, you know, letting them know that the people don't want his agenda. And on the top right, you can see a power map of all these different right-wing think tanks and front groups that are affiliated or connected to Jeffrey S. in some way. And we use this too because not only does it show how many issues his money and his influence impacts in our state, which galvanizes a lot of different groups to work against him, but it also allows us to meet him at different places. So, for example, we went to an event hosted by the PA Manufacturers Association in New York last year to confront the people that were attending this really lavish party and meeting where both Democrats and Republicans were, to say, hey, we sometimes voted for you, for the Democrats there or Republicans there. We don't want you associating with this organization that takes money from Jeffrey Yass, this toxic billionaire. And then on the bottom right, you can see there, we and others have used nonprofit research that you learned last time through 990s to connect Jeffrey Yass to anti-Muslim organizations through his foundation, and also pro-Israel think tanks or right-wing think tanks in Israel. And I'm going to turn it over to Molly now to talk about an example from New York.
Yeah, I'm just going to talk about maybe a kind of similar but a little different example of some organizing that Little Sis was part of supporting in New York, challenging billionaires. So here's a bunch of headlines from a coalition, a bunch of groups in New York, like New York's Communities for Change, Make the Road, Citizen Action, tenant rights groups, kind of recognized that New York billionaires were coming up again and again as key blocks to passing progressive policies across all different issue areas, climate, housing, education funding, but also kind of saw that billionaire wealth, particularly in New York State, where there's the most billionaires, I think, in the country, is also like a key resource that we could go after to fund social infrastructure that we need. So they started a campaign called Make Billionaires Pay, which you can see on this little cake down here. I'll talk about that in a second. Basically highlighting billionaire wealth in the state of New York, exposing their ties to political power, and making the case over and over in a bunch of different venues, whether it was through direct actions, lobbying, having politicians adopt talking points at Cuomo's, the governor at the time's birthday party, making the case for taxing the rich. And so as part of that, Little Sis did a bunch of research and published some reports that included like campaign finance research on how former Governor Cuomo had basically been bankrolled by these billionaires for his entire political career. There were protests that went directly to billionaires themselves in the Hamptons and on Park Avenue, which are kind of like concentrations of where a lot of them live. And then also did a lot of research as part of kind of like communications and media strategy to push back on talking points that the billionaires and their kind of political allies were pushing, particularly around that, like, if you tax billionaires, they will leave the state of New York. And we kind of like showed that wasn't true. So this involved doing, like I was saying, some campaign finance research, identifying kind of where there are key nodes of billionaire assets in the state geographically, and then also understanding kind of their social networks and ties, which is how folks ended up bringing this birthday cake with the message to make billionaires pay to Cuomo's kind of like big birthday bash. That was a big fundraiser and party for him every year. So yeah, like Ali said, we're gonna talk a little bit now about like particular research tools and research questions that you guys can think about when wanting to investigate billionaires, but kind of have in mind from these examples and other examples that I'm sure y'all have, or maybe can be brainstorming of what you would do with the info you find. Oh, this is another example, just to kind of underline what Ali was saying about the role that billionaires play right now. and are increasingly playing not just as our political opponents, but also as our bosses and landlords. So for example, up here, we have the richest real estate billionaires, including Donald Bren and Stephen Ross, Steven Schwartzman, who increasingly aren't even like just pushing policies that are bad for working people and for tenants, but are literally people's landlords that they're paying rent to. And so there's increasing attempts to like map out the networks of these particular billionaire landlords, both in terms of what real estate they own, but also in terms of their personal and business networks and relationships that could be pressured by tenants. For example, in New York and in California, where people are really directly feeling the pressure of billionaires making money off of their homes. And now we go, and I'm going to hand it back to Allie.
Yeah, so we just gave you a couple examples. I'm sure you all have experienced other examples of billionaires trying to be held accountable. But before we get into some of these tools specifically, of course, billionaires are people. So a lot of these principles will apply to power mapping or researching any individual. And we're going to talk about some tools that would be specific to wealthy people or billionaires, but you can really use these for anyone. So you can call back to some of the skills that we talked about in the research and corporations training a few months ago, where we talked about searching SEC filings, figuring out who's on the board of different organizations. So that will come into play. You can also use the tools we talked about in last month's training when we talked about researching nonprofits and searching in ProPublica's Nonprofit Explorer page. You can search names to see if they come up in 990s. We'll talk about mapping out their relationships to academic and cultural institutions, personal relationships. Molly will talk about researching assets like real estate or jets, yachts, things like that. And I'm going to talk about campaign finance a little bit, but in September, we'll have a training on money and politics that'll dig even more into it. So first step when you're researching a billionaire or looking for a billionaire in your state that you think might have a lot of influence, I would start with the Forbes list. So people have probably heard of the Forbes World's Billionaires list in the news, but every year Forbes publishes a list of every billionaire in the world. And it's really useful because they have a profile on all of them. And I'm going to show you different ways you can use Forbes just to get some really basic information on different billionaires and research what billionaires you might want to target or hold accountable in your state. So first thing is just their annual list of the world's richest people, the world's billionaires. They publish this as sort of a snapshot in time, who is the richest person at this point in time. And it's really useful because they have detailed information about some of the wealthiest people. They give a little bit of narrative. In 2024's list, they mentioned that it set a record for the most billionaires ever in a year. And right now, there are over 2,781 billionaires around the world. And so that's a lot of profiles, so a lot of good information if you are interested in researching billionaires. And I can show you a couple ways to dig into it on Forbes. Another list they have is their real-time billionaires list, which is similar, but this is a constantly updating list of real-time how much wealth each of these top billionaires have. So you can see that column where it says change, that shows the huge swings sometimes because of stock performance. A lot of these people have so much of their wealth tied up in stock to one or two companies. Because of that stock, their wealth can change sometimes very dramatically. You can see like Elon Musk's wealth can dip by over $1 billion in the matter of a day. And to him, that might not be that much, but you can see how impactful it can be. But this can show you in real time who is the richest in the world and what their net worth is. And then if you click through the names on this list or the previous list I showed, you can get to their profile on Forbes, which tells you what their net worth is, how they made their money, a couple bullet points about them that is usually useful, shows you where they live, if they're married, so you know whether you can research a spouse or their family. And what I like is their wealth history, so it shows you how their wealth has grown over time. And for a lot of the richest people in the world, you can see their wealth pretty much skyrocket after 2020. So you can really see that 60% growth from 2020 throughout the pandemic, and this massive hoarding of wealth by billionaires in the world. Forbes also has a richest person in every state map that they update every year, which is really useful because I would be willing to bet that people don't recognize most people on this list. So we often think about the billionaires that are like celebrities, like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, but there are lots of really influential billionaires in every state that play a big role in politics and society in those states that you might not have heard of before. So if you're curious, go check out this map. We can share it in the chat too, to find the billionaire in your state. There are 3 states with no billionaires: Alaska, Delaware, and West Virginia. And the states with the most are New York, California, and Florida. And then, of course, we at Little Sis have our own database where you can do research on billionaires. If you go to littlesis.org/database, you can search any billionaire's name or a company and find them through the company they're affiliated with, to find lots of connections and information on them, like businesses or corporations where they've held positions, board memberships, nonprofit donations, campaign donations, family and social ties, and then a basic bio about them on the right there. So if you are doing research on a billionaire after this training, you can check out on our YouTube page an explainer of how to update Little Sis yourself, to make sure we like to make sure our research is actually used. So making it public and putting it on Little Sis is going to be helpful maybe to another person researching that billionaire. So if you come across some useful information or good information and it's not on Little Sis, please make an account and add it. All right, so now I'm going to switch to campaign finance research. So like I said, we're going to talk more about this in our September training. So I'm not going to get into FEC research right now, but if you can't wait and you need to research your billionaire on the FEC website, you can go to fec.gov/data to research federal campaign donations. It's actually a really great site and fairly easy to use. It allows you to download data, really narrow down your searches. When you're researching a billionaire and their name, just be comprehensive and creative with it. For example, like I researched Jeffrey Yass a lot. Sometimes he goes by Jeff, sometimes Jeffrey, and he uses different names and employer names on his campaign finance forms. So, make sure you're trying to be as expansive as possible. And also, you can do a little bit of research to find out who their spouse is, if they have one, and make sure you search their name as well. Usually, if they're donating directly to a campaign, there's a limit on how much an individual can donate to a campaign. So they'll get their spouse to donate as well, or, children of a certain family, different executives at a company. So just make sure you're being comprehensive and searching a spouse's name just to catch everything that they're giving in politics. Open Secrets is another great tool. I'm going to do a quick screen share of that in a second for federal and state campaign finance research. If you're in a state and you're trying to figure out how much of an impact billionaires have in your state elections or state politics, a couple sites I use for this are transparencyusa.org and followthemoney.org. These are both really useful. Transparency USA doesn't have every state, but for the states they do, I think it's really helpful. And then, of course, every state has their own campaign finance database. It's just hard for us to do a training on it because they're all different. But try typing that billionaire's name in there, and you should be able to come up with something. And then, of course, Google searches. I'm going to show examples of this a little bit later, but Usually, if billionaires are participating in politics, they're donating a lot of money because to them, it's not that much money. So you can just do a simple put your donor's name in quotes, use the word and capitalize it, and then search terms on Google like campaign contribution, campaign donation, um, donor, political donor, anything like that to see if there are news articles about your research target or billionaire. You could also, if you're looking in a specific state, put a state's name in quotes and add this donor name and campaign contribution. A lot of times these big donations will be covered in the news because in a state and local race, $1 million has a lot more reach and can have a lot bigger impact than a federal level race. So sometimes billionaires spend the same amount of money on a state level race, but it can go a lot farther. So it's usually newsworthy, and that can be a really basic and useful tool. So I'm going to exit out of this real quick to show you Open Secrets. So we use Open Secrets all the time, and we're going to talk about it a lot more in September. But I'm just going to show you a couple ways you can use it to research billionaires really quick. I'm going to start by going to opensecrets.org, go to the Elections and Fundraising Data tab, and I'm first going to go to Donor Lookup. And this will bring you to their really easy search tool for individual donors. If it loads. Okay, let's try it again. All right. So you can see they're very like simple search tool here, and you can put in the name of the person you're trying to research in here. I like to go to the advanced search button down here just to narrow it down a little bit. These are usually donors that have donated a lot of money, so you want to try to narrow down as much as possible so you're not, getting these huge lists of campaign donations. So I'll try to research the guy that I mentioned in my example, Jeffrey Yass. So I'm gonna search Jeffrey Yass or just Jeff Yass. That's what he usually goes by. And I'm just gonna return campaign donations in the 2024 election cycle. So that'll return everything in 2023 and 2024 so far. And come down here and search. And it's going to give me every campaign donation that it has for Jeff Yass. And I can sort by date or amount. And you can see some of his huge donations to the Club for Growth, which is a very conservative right-wing PAC, Protect Freedom PAC, which is his school privatization PAC on a federal level. And it's great because it also shows you not just federal donations, but the state donation to Greg Abbott in Texas, which was the largest campaign donation ever made in Texas. So this is one way you can pull up donations from Jeffrey Yass. You can also, if you go back to the search page, just search his last name, and that can bring up not just Jeffrey Yass, but also his wife, Janine Yass. So if you search Janine, you can find a couple donations made by her. And you can see she labels herself a philanthropist. So it can be a little hard to track her down by searching employer like you would Jeffrey Yass. Or I know Jeffrey Yass is the co-founder, managing director of a financial firm, trading firm called Susquehanna International Group. So I want to see if him or his co-founders have donated in this election cycle. So he has a lot of control over SIG, Susquehanna. So it would be meaningful to me if he got other employees or his co-founders to donate as well to try to maximize his impact. So I'm going to go down to this employer of the donor. They have to list their employer. And in the 2024 election cycle, and just search that. And it'll bring me back everyone who listed Susquehanna International Group as their employer. And I'll sort by amount again. And of course, Jeffrey Yass is up here on top, but also you can see some other folks that work with him that have donated to plenty of other politicians. And they don't just donate to Republicans. On a federal level, they often do, but you'll find plenty of Democrats as well. Jeffrey Yass donates to Democrats in Pennsylvania, as do his colleagues. And I'm going to show you one more time what you can do with Open Secrets. If you go back up to this Elections and Fundraising Data tab and go to Elections Overview, go to Donors, and then this question here, who are the biggest donors? So whenever you see the press say this person is the biggest donor in this election cycle, this is where you would find that information. So I have it set to the 2024 election cycle, all federal contributions. So any way they could possibly give money to elections, which is, as you can see, several different ways. It gives you the list of the top donors in the country right now. And on the side here, this color stripe tells you what party they give to. So you can see one Democratic donor down here, but most of them are Republican donors. You can see Jeffrey Yass is number 2. Timothy Mellon of the Mellon family, BNY Mellon, very wealthy family actually from Pittsburgh, where I'm from, is a top donor right now. And Richard Uihlein of Illinois also spends a lot of time in Wisconsin as number 3. So this is a really great tool if you're just curious what billionaires are having the most impact in our elections right now. You can export this. You can search names in here. You can switch election cycles just to go back and look. But it's a really great tool to use. One more way to research billionaires using Google is, so if you want to search for a scandal, maybe you're trying to look for vulnerabilities that the billionaire you're researching has, or previous scandals that you can maybe lift up in the media if it hasn't been covered very much, or you're trying to, look into a lawsuit that you can file to maybe hold that corporation accountable, and you want to see what previous lawsuits they've faced. You can use similar Google search tools to do that. And I'm going to show you that in a second. I'm also going to talk and do another quick demo of the Good Jobs First violation tracker, which I think went over in the corporate research training, but we'll do it again because it's another good way to research billionaires and their corporations that they usually make money off of. So if we go to Google, if you want to search for a scandal or lawsuits, you can just simply put your billionaire's name in quotes. I'm going to start by using Elon Musk because he has a lot of scandals, as you can probably imagine. So what I'm doing is putting Elon Musk in quotes. So I want that whole phrase. And so I want, both of these search terms to come back in my results. And scandal, it'll bring up news and recent examples of some incident where Elon Musk was involved in a scandal. And you can do the same thing. I would recommend doing the same thing, but changing the word here from scandal to lawsuit, harassment, anything that might bring up something that that billionaire or the corporation they're involved with has done that got them negative news attention. And you would also want to make sure, so for example, Jeffrey Yass is associated with the Susquehanna International Group. So let's try Jeff Yass here. or let's do lawsuit this time. He might not have lawsuits against him personally, where it might not turn up that much. You know, we have a couple related to TikTok, because TikTok was in the news recently. But what I would also want to do for him, because he uses his financial firm to wield power, I would also want to search his financial firm and lawsuit. So that would bring up some different results that we might want to dig into more. Like I read this one earlier, one thing that he has been accused of is manipulating the stock price, because that's part of what they do. All right, and I'm going to finally go over to the Good Jobs First violation tracker. If you want to learn more about this tool, we did talk about it in the corporate research training, but I'm going to show one example. This is violationtracker.goodjobsfirst.org, and allows you to search a company or a parent company to search any violation they've received in the past. I think going back to 2001 or maybe even earlier. So I'm going to search Koch Industries to research well-known billionaire Charles Koch, who has benefited and profited from Koch Industries, made him a billionaire. And if you search, it brings up any violation that they have received a penalty for or a settlement for, or that they paid a settlement for. You can search by year, you can search by penalty amount, and it'll tell you what were the most recent ones or the most expensive ones, or you can click on the parent company link and it'll take you to that company's profile page. And you can see they've paid over $1 billion in penalties since 2000. So this is another way, if your billionaire has made a lot of money from one company, make sure you do plenty of research on that corporation, using the tools that we talked about in the research and corporations training. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Molly to talk about more tools.
Cool. Thanks, Allie. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. So a couple other things that are often kind of things that at Little Sis when we're researching billionaires as part of campaign research that come up, and that oftentimes I feel like people are reaching out to us, like activists, to try to figure out with their local billionaires, are understanding what kinds of assets a particular billionaire owns, where their money is tied up. And oftentimes, as Ali was kind of talking about before, their wealth is tied up in stocks and corporate securities, as well as assets like real estates, private jets, yachts. And all of these things can be helpful to know for a lot of different contexts, including like thinking back to some of those examples, campaign examples we were talking about at the beginning. For example, like with the Make Billionaires Pay campaign in New York, we did a lot of kind of like press work, highlighting the mansions and yachts and kind of like extreme lavish spending that billionaires do, to highlight kind of what making them pay their taxes would mean, and kind of like the divide between how they were living and how the vast majority of New Yorkers were living. And I think like a lot of that stuff we all kind of like, it's kind of like no duh, we know that, but putting kind of specific numbers and yachts and mansions to a specific face can be really helpful in a lot of different ways. So starting with real estate, I feel like this is a question we get asked a lot at Little Sis, is how to identify like what mansion does a particular executive or billionaire own. And a lot of this stuff, it kind of takes some kind of like creative Googling and patching together different sources, and there's lots of different ways to get to it. So I'm just going to talk about a few. You know, as usual, starting with a Google of just like the name of the billionaire and mansion or condo or estate, or house, can turn some things up. Oftentimes there's like particular kind of real estate and business press that will report on when very wealthy people buy or sell houses. So stuff like Curbed or The Real Deal or kind of a local business journal that most cities have. If Google isn't kind of coming up with stuff, it's worth doing some searches within those websites. Um, and then there's some kind of more kind of primary sources that you can go to for this. So one, we're not going to go into showing an example of this because it kind of differs place by place, but usually it's on either the city or county level, has a property record database. So usually if you just Google like Philadelphia property records or Ann Arbor property records, it will come up. And you can search for billionaires' names in there to see if there is an address associated with them. Oftentimes, they will hold real estate in kind of LLCs or various kind of networks of shell corporations. So whereas like you or I might have our house in our name, oftentimes they won't. So that can be a little bit hit or miss. It can be a helpful way to double check, like if you saw something reported that's maybe like in an old newspaper article or is an old Google search. You can go to the local property records database and try to double check like, oh, is this address correct? Is the LLC correct? And you can oftentimes see how much they sold the house for, how much it's worth, all that kind of stuff. A couple other ways to identify real estate holdings. Sometimes when billionaires make campaign contributions, there will be an address associated with it. Oftentimes in that FEC database that we're going to talk more about next time. So in more the like actual record that comes up as opposed to open secrets, they'll have to put an address. Sometimes that will be a business address or it'll be a PO box, but sometimes it might be an address of a mansion or other kind of like real estate asset that you can then do some Googling and figure out what it is. The other thing for real estate holdings is that there's some pay for databases like Lexis that really are kind of like the gold standard of figuring some of that stuff out. So most people don't have access to that, but if you are a university student, you might. If you work for a union, you probably do. You might have friends who have access to it. But in terms of identifying like particular real estate assets, that's kind of like the best gold standard one. But some of these other methods can oftentimes yield some results as well. And this is some examples of these kinds of research finds and stuff that we've done for it. So also oftentimes within particular geographies, there are kind of like big billionaire addresses where a lot of them live. So an example of that is the 740 Park Avenue. There's the Tower of Power. So you can see here a little cis map of 5 different billionaires. A Coke billionaire, Steven Schwartzman, who's the CEO of Blackstone, biggest corporate landlord in the world. Head of Millennium Management, Israel Eglander. Howard Marks, who's another Wall Street billionaire. Ronald Lauder, who's the head of Estee Lauder. All 5 of those billionaires live at this one address, 740 Park Ave. So that was something that, again, the Make Billionaires Pay coalition used as part of their direct action strategy and media strategy. And, it also can be really helpful, like I was mentioning before, sometimes to just talk about these assets to really give like pictures and particularities to what this level of wealth means. So there's a picture here of Ken Griffin, who's one of the biggest hedge fund managers in the world and one of the biggest Republican Party donors in the world. I think he bought what at the time was the most expensive house to ever be bought, which is this $450 million house in Palm Beach. So again, as part of campaigns that we've worked on, for example, when education activists and advocates in Chicago were calling for Ken Griffin to be taxed at higher rates, we used information about this massive estate to point out why he could afford to pay more taxes. Some other assets that can be useful along the same line is finding planes, private planes, and yachts that these billionaires own. There's a couple ways to do that. Again, you can try to just Google, the name and plane or yacht, jet, Gulfstream. There's kind of like press that are particular to like fans of private planes and super yachts. So for example, like this superyachtfan.com, I'll show people that. This is just like a blog that lists kind of like mega yachts from around the world, and sometimes we'll just have like particular models up here, but oftentimes we'll identify who their owners are. So for example, Dr. Phil's yacht, Bad Romance. One of the Murdoch heirs is on here. So this can be worthwhile to do. Mark Zuckerberg. So to do some name searches and kind of click around on to see where your local billionaire or billionaire of interest has their money tied up. And then private planes, there's as of now a federal database that we can use to identify some of that. It seems like Trump might change that, but for now, this is kind of the best place to go for information. And you can search here just by people's names. So for example, we were working on a campaign around healthcare workers at Hospital Corporation of America, the biggest for-profit hospital chain. And the CEO there is a billionaire named Tom Frist. So you can search by last name. And then you have to do kind of a little bit of logicking to figure out and make sure that the yacht or the jet that you're looking at is connected to the person you're looking for. But so for example, here, these are all the planes that come up that have Frist in them. There's this owner, Frist Aviation LLC. I can take a look at that and it pulls up a bunch of information about this plane. And in this case, I looked here at registered owner. So even though it's an LLC, I Googled this address and saw that the address corresponds to Frist Capital, which is Tom Frist's financial firm. So it seems like a pretty good bet that this belongs to him. And you can Google around to see more details about the plane to kind of get the really crazy info about it. But so for example, this Falcon 900X, that's the name of the type of plane. And you can Google that and see pictures of it, see how crazy it is, see how many people it fits up to. And most of them will have kind of like, pages for this. So that's the kind of the most surefire way how to find planes and yachts. The other thing that can be helpful to figure out is kind of what billionaires own in terms of financial assets. And a lot of this we talked about also on kind of like the corporate webinar. But just to reiterate, if you're looking at things kind of starting with a billionaire rather than starting with a corporation, you obviously want to know like what corporations they're affiliated with, but you can also do some digging starting with them. So for example, we can use the SEC's Edgar database, which I know, again, we talked all about in that corporations training. You can search by companies and by stock symbols, but you can also search by individual names. So we'll just use Elon Musk again as an example here. I'll type him in, and he has his own little identification number. And this basically is pulling up all filings that have been filed with the SEC that have Elon Musk affiliated with them. So we can look at this first one from February of this year. It's a form that's called the 13G. It says Statement of Beneficial Ownership by certain investors. Click on that. And if we look at it, we see it's from Tesla up here. And it basically is the most updated information about how many shares of Tesla Elon Musk owns, which you can see here in these sections that talk about voting power. And then as well as what percentage of the company Elon Musk owns. So here you can see 20.5%. So there's other ways you could get to this information, but this can be helpful to just do a search of the person's name in the Edgar database and kind of click around and see what else comes up. Yeah, a lot of this is just kind of being like knowing the tools, knowing what information you have, like you're looking at Elon Musk and seeing kind of what comes up. So that's a thing that can be helpful for understanding stock ownership. The other thing to think about, again, is that these are people, but they are connected to corporations, and it's always good to be kind of in whatever venue you're doing research, searching them as people, but also searching their related corporations, like how Allie was doing with Susquehanna International Group. A lot of the billionaires that we look at Little Sis tend to be kind of Wall Street made, including big hedge funds and private equity managers. So some helpful tools for that to figure out what they own. Whale Wisdom is like a really great go-to. So you can see here, this basically takes actually that form from the SEC called the 13F that big investment firms have to file to show what they own, and puts them all in this database so that you can search it kind of easier with an easier interface. So for example, a couple of years ago, Little Sis was doing some work with farm workers that were in the Wendy's supply chain, and figured out that a big stake of Wendy's was owned by a billionaire hedge fund manager named Nelson Peltz, and his hedge fund is called Tryon Fund. So you can search here for the name of the hedge fund. And then if you go here to this 13F holding summary, it brings up this really nice, easy to use spreadsheet that's basically saying this is everything that Nelson Peltz's hedge fund owns. And you can organize it by ownership percentage. So this is showing us what in their portfolio do they have the biggest stake in. So the first thing is Janus Henderson. Then we see Wendy's. That's the one I was talking about. Invesco, also a really large stake in Disney. And so this is a way to figure out what else Nelson Peltz owns. So if you were campaigning on him, this could be helpful to understand. A couple of other things that, again, are things that we often look at and have people asking us to look at. So social networks of billionaires. We were talking about that a little bit with that, going to Andrew Cuomo's birthday party and knowing that a bunch of New York billionaires who weren't paying nearly enough in taxes would be there. Also, the example Allie was giving about that PA Manufacturing Association. So oftentimes billionaires exert their power through donations and seats on boards to nonprofits or trade groups, colleges, kind of use social capital through exclusive country clubs or other types of social clubs. And so it can be helpful to understand kind of what are their more like personal social networks, and what are things that they might care about that we could put pressure on there. Some tips for finding that stuff. So this is also a little bit like can be kind of some creative Googling, and also kind of like on the ground research, asking around, understanding just kind of the landscape, or what are the major kind of like power elite social institutions in the place where they live. But you can look at the nonprofit training we did to go through some of this, but oftentimes you want to look at kind of their official biographies on websites. They'll talk about what boards they're on. For identifying kind of like country clubs or other kind of exclusive social clubs, it can be helpful to do some Googling. We've talked about this before, I think, but kind of searching by particular file types. So you can do file type : PDF to just search for PDFs. And then you could search, for example, like Jeff Yass and Country Club and see if things come up and just like do a bunch of different kind of like creative searches like that. The other thing that it can be helpful to use is this ProPublica Nonprofit Explorer. So I'm going to show that real quick. This basically kind of similar to Whale Wisdom, where this is like a friendlier interface for a bunch of disclosures, takes 990 forms, which is the form that nonprofits have to file with the IRS, and puts them into a really easily navigable place. And you can search by nonprofit names, but you can also search by person names. So that's what I'm going to show right now. So people. And again, continuing with that Jeff Yass example, we can search for him and start to see that he's coming up as a director at something called the Claus Foundation, a grant making foundation. We also want to make sure to search for different iterations of names, like when you're searching for people, make sure to do that. So I did Jeffrey Yass, but then Jeffrey Yass turns up a whole bunch of other stuff of director relationships. And then the other thing also about billionaires is oftentimes they will kind of be influential families and will kind of like install their family members in different key positions. So make sure to figure out kind of if you're looking at a particular billionaire, who are they married to? Who are their kids? And kind of understanding those networks. So for example, like Ali was talking about, Jeff Yass's wife is named Janine. So we can also search for her and see that then she's coming up as a board member at a lot of education privatization organizations around Philadelphia. So this is another really great way to start mapping out the networks of kind of like nonprofit groups that have billionaire ties. I think that's most of what we wanted to talk about in terms of assets and how you find them. Some of that stuff is also listed on Little Sis. So the example that Ali was showing at the beginning of those different profiles can be a good place to start for some of this as well. But I think that mostly wraps up the tools that we wanted to go over for tonight. We did want to make sure that folks know that we're doing this next training about money and politics, where we're going to be going kind of much deeper on open secrets, but also on federal and state campaign finance databases. And that's going to be in September. So we're taking next month off, but September 19th will be the next one. So we hope that folks can join us for that. We also were hoping that folks could, like we did last time, answer a poll about tonight's training to help us figure out what we're doing well, what can be improved for next time. So I think Manira is going to launch that. Cool. So if people could just answer these three questions about what worked well this time, what could be improved, and also if there's any particular topics or research skills you want us to cover in the future. This is the first year we're doing this, and we're hoping to kind of keep building on it for next year. So I'll give people a couple minutes to answer so that we can keep doing these. And give folks a couple more minutes. Okay, cool. We'll do maybe like 1 more minute. There's still some responses coming in. Okay, cool. Manira, does that look good? And
Looks great.
okay, cool. Thank you. Cool. Thanks, everyone. We really appreciate that as we're continuing to build this out. So a couple other things as we are heading out. We have lots of more resources that kind of go in depth even more than we did tonight. You can go to mapthepower.net to see kind of all of our different toolkits that we have that go a little bit deeper. We will send an email, like I was saying, with the slides, but if you want to scan this QR code right now, you can, and the slides will be up there, both from tonight and from previous sessions. I will wait 20 seconds so people can scan it if they so choose. Okay, cool. And then, yeah, if you have questions, feel free to reach out. Here's info about how to get in touch with me, and all the different Little Sis channels that we're on. We're always glad to, I'll go back to the QR code, yes. We're always glad to give more support in research questions and problems. QR code is up there again. And last but not least, we do these trainings for free, which we're really happy to do. But if you feel moved to donate to Little Sis so we can keep doing them, we would really appreciate that. You can go to littlesis.org/donate. And I think that's all for tonight. Like I said, we'll send out that email and we'll hopefully see you all in September for campaign finance research. And yeah, continuing this research tools for organizers training. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your evening.